Good day and welcome back to The Shed. Today we go back to 2003 to take a look at Robert J. Sawyer's Hugo Award-winning novel for that year, Hominids. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a spoiler-free plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked and what I didn't like in this one. We'll put it to the memory test. I'll make recommendations based on similar novels that we've read and ranked on our Hugo and Nebula Sci-Fi Shed ladder, where I've been ranking all these wonderful novels. And please excuse the croaky voice today. I'm just getting over, a pretty nasty cold, but I'm feeling much better. So this is a rather interesting one, because in this parallel universe, we find that the Neanderthals have become the dominant species, and the Glycin, the Homo sapiens, have become extinct. And what we learn is that in this parallel universe, there's this great scientist by the name of Ponta Bodit, who's performing this experiment with his partner, a guy called Adicor. And the two are working away, and all of a sudden, Ponta just vanishes in what appears to be thin air. He just completely disappears, leaving Adicor rather puzzled as to what's happened here. More puzzling though is what happens to Ponta, because he finds himself awake and he seems to be in a body of water somewhere, and it's all dark and he doesn't know what's going on. And to the surprise of the Glycin, or the humans in this parallel universe in which he's materialized in, they're sort of looking at this guy and thinking, how did someone get into this heavy water? They've got some experiments happening back on Earth as well. So he finds himself in this pool of heavy water, and these humans are all sort of puzzled and thinking, how could someone have possibly got in here? We're miles underground. And then when I eventually see this guy and I start looking at him thinking, are our eyes deceiving us? This guy looks like he's some kind of prehistoric man, a Neanderthal. And when he starts speaking this alien language, two sort of come together pretty quickly, and they realize, hey, this is something bizarre going on here. Meanwhile, in the parallel Neanderthal universe, we find that Adicor is in all sorts of trouble because they've accused him of murdering his partner Ponta. So things are not looking good for him at all. And he has to go through this whole process of a trial in a society that uses some really interesting surveillancing equipment. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we find that Ponta is being quarantined, and he's been put into a home with key personnel that first discovered Ponta, and he's sort of making friendships of sorts. He's starting to pick up the language very quickly due to an implant that he has. Very interesting tech, by the way. So he starts to quickly pick up the languages and really starts to understand what this planet is about, and potentially the differences between the two parallel universes, and is there a way to get back home. So it's a really interesting novel, this one. It covers themes like parallel evolution, cultural divergence, one which I found really interesting around the nature of morality, as well as the role, the justice systems, and the role that surveillance has in such a system. So a rather interesting novel, this one. So what is there to like in Hominids by Robert J. Sawyer? Look, for me, it would have to be the premise. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed that concept of parallel universes and the what if. What if we did find this parallel universe and Homo sapiens, or Glycin as they were called in this parallel universe, were not the dominant species? So rather interesting, and I really like the way Robert J. Sawyer built this parallel culture, and how cultural diversity would happen in a world like that. So I did enjoy that concept. I also really enjoyed the concept of the nature of morality. It was a really interesting one, and one that I'll come back to when it comes to the dislikes, some of the dislikes I had in this novel. But I like the concept that we're brave enough to talk about things like this in a science fiction novel. And that's one of the things that I really love about science fiction. You can really tackle any theme, and I'm always inspired by that. I'm always glad that authors take on those challenges, albeit not necessarily a strong argument, and I'll come back to that when I talk to my dislikes. But I do want to stress that I really enjoyed the concept here, that philosophical exploration. I like that he wasn't shying away from tough subjects, things like, the nature of morality, religion, and what part that plays in a society of intellectual beings, right? As well as the role of surveillance in a society like this. So really interesting concept, but what didn't I like in all of that? So what is there not to like in Robert J. Sawyer's Hominids? And it will have to be this, and I see it so often in science fiction that it really is a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to make an argument around the nature of morality, make it a sound and balanced argument. I do not want to see a scale, tipped one way or the other. I want to see a balanced argument, and I want to be free to make up my own choices based on the data that you provide me. But so often what we find in these kind of novels, unfortunately, is that it's never really a balanced discussion. It's never really a balanced argument. We always find that there's one point of view that the author wants to put forward that is the strongest point of view. And I made that criticisms of Harry Harrison's Death World too, when the author definitely had a preconceived idea of the argument in which way the scale should be tipped, and he provided two protagonists and antagonists with different worldviews, and one was just so weak and pathetic compared to the other that as a reader you would automatically levitate to one to the author's point of view. And I just don't like that. I want to see a balanced point of view, one that we see in James Blish's A Case of Conscience, right? He had a real dilemma, the priest in that novel, trying to find out exactly what these alien beings had to do. But he, as in James Blish, brought a really balanced argument, and he left the reader to make up his own mind, his or her own mind, as to what happened at the end of the novel. He just provided a balanced argument, left you to make up your own choice. Very agnostic view of that idea. And unfortunately, that's not the case here, and it really irks me when I see it, right? If you're going to make an argument like Robert J. Sawyer did in this novel around the, religion, around deity, around any religious worldview, and just sort of dismiss it by saying, well, we are Neanderthals, and we don't, there is no God, and this is the nature of the universe, and this is what we believe in. That's all fantastic. But don't put on the other side of the argument a so-called a devout Christian who cannot answer, or devout Catholic in this particular case, who cannot answer fundamental questions regarding their faith, right? Bring a balanced argument, because I couldn't help but reading through this, and you don't have to have a degree in apologetics to have a counter argument, or at least a response to every single thing that the Neanderthal talked to. Now, I don't want to be that guy that wants to point you one direction or another. All I'm saying is have that balanced approach. You avid writers out there, if you're writing a novel, bring a balanced argument and let the reader make up their own choice as to what, if any, do I want to tilt towards. But this is I'm so biased that I just didn't care for it. And I thought it was a real letdown, because it was a really interesting premise that I thought could have gone a lot much further, and it really would have helped me escalate this up the board when we go to rank it later on. The other thing I'd have to say is it just felt like heavy-handed moralizing at times. I mean, it just felt like that. It felt like I'm on this soapbox and I'm this Neanderthal, and I just want to tell you how bad you guys are for making things like what those elephants called, the mammoths, those big mammoths extinct, and how upset I'm about this, and how terrible of a place this must be for us to allow, or our ancestors to allow, a creature like this to become extinct. There was a bit of that going on in the book, a little bit of moralizing around religion, around environmentally aware, right? And I just can't help but think that it was just a bit out of flavor for me. I just don't know. It could be a personal thing, but I just found that's first point was a big one for me. I just don't like it when that happens in novels. Like I said, and I reiterate, I want to see that balanced approach. And I honestly don't care what it is. That's the funny thing. I don't want you to get the impression that I believe one thing or another. I just want to see both sides of an argument made strongly, not one favouring the other. And that was the same with the environmental damage that Earthlings have created. It was very unbalanced, and I just don't like that. I can't help but feel it's this guy, Robert J. Sawyer, getting on a soapbox and preaching to us. And if I want to get someone to preach to me, I'll go to church, right? I don't want to see that in my books. The other thing I'd have to mention in my dislike section is that there's this very implausible romance that happens between an Earthling and this Neanderthal. And I made similar criticisms when we reviewed No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop. I don't know, man. I just could not understand how a human could be attractive to something like what we saw in No Enemy But Time, those hominids, as well as these Neanderthals. I just don't get it. It could be a personal thing, but I just don't understand how a human could be attracted to an ape-like ancestor of ours. But maybe I'm alone in that, and I'll leave that up to you to comment down below. So can I still recommend Hominids by Robert J. Sawyer? And I'd have to say, look, I don't know about this one, honestly. I think if some of the things that I talked to in my plot overview sort of interest you, then definitely have a go. It's not a badly written novel. And maybe if you want to counter my argument I made in my dislike section, maybe, if you want to see what I'm talking about, maybe have a go. See if you find it as unbalanced as I did. Maybe that'll be a reason to read this one. But apart from that, I think there are definitely better novels on the Sci-Fi Shed ladder, and one that I wouldn't be screaming down your neck to have a go at first. But when it comes to similar novels, I can make some recommendations here, because when it comes to getting that shock of a completely different environment, that culture shock of this is so alien to me, and is this really Earth? Then I'd have to say have a go at The Forever Machine. Now this is a militarization novel. It's a wonderful novel, but the main protagonist goes through this huge time dilation, and he really has a culture shock when he comes back to Earth to see just how much the world has moved on from where he left it. And for me, it was so much more emotional, so much more impactful than more than anything else we see in Hominids by Robert J. Sawyer. So I'd say if you want to see that cultural drift, that cultural shock, I think there's no better novel than The Forever War. So say have a go at that before you have a go at Hominids. The other one I'd have to talk about, if you like that interdimensional contact with alien beings, and what would they look like, and how would they communicate with us, and due to some experiment, then I'd have to say definitely have a go at Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves, because that's exactly what happens in this novel. But Asimov, Sawyer, you can't compare the two. This is top shelf whiskey. I'd have to say Hominids is probably your, Walmart special bottom of the rack whiskey, right? And not to take too much away from it, it still is a very good novel. I guess I'm just exaggerating that this is by far the better kind of novel if you like that contact between these parallel universes. So the other novel I'd have to mention if we're going to talk Hominids, it would have to be No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop, because this here, the main protagonist, is this really interesting child who becomes an adult eventually through the novel, who has the ability to travel back in time through his mind. It's never quite explained. It's rather interesting how it happens. But he goes to this prehistoric time where the Homo habilis? Homo habilis. He becomes a member of the tribe, and he has a romantic relationship with one of these hominids, which gets into some really interesting places, which I'll say, if you like that concept of prehistory and looking at what these pre-humans look like and how they may have acted in what society they may have acted in, I'd say have a go at No Enemy But Time and vice versa. I think there is still something in Hominids that will appeal to a lot of people, so I don't want to take that away from it. We've got to rank it on the Sci-Fi Shed ladder. I wonder where this one's going to rank. What do you reckon? A or B side? Well, let's find out soon. So back to the Sci-Fi Shed ladder to rank today's Hugo award-winning novel by Robert J. Sawyer, Hominids. And I'm looking at the B side of the board because during my recommendations and similar novels, I made a note, mentioned that The Gods Themselves, if we're talking whiskey, will be your top tier whiskey, right? Compared to Hominids, which I said would be your bottom of the rung Walmart sort of special, right? So we're definitely looking at the right side of the board. And I'm going to definitely say that there's no way that Hominids is going to challenge The Gods Themselves on the board. So maybe when we look at the middle of the rung here, a good place to start would be The Terminal Experiment by none other than Robert J. Sawyer himself, the novel that won the Nebula in 1995. And if I was to rank the two, I would definitely say that The Terminal Experiment was the better of his two novels. I made a note during my review of The Terminal Experiment that I said it's something along the lines that it read like a screenplay, and I could really see this on the big screen as a movie, and I thought it would make a really cool, science fiction movie. And to some degree that is true of Hominids as well, but if I'm going to rank the two, I'm definitely going to say The Terminal Experiment is the better of the bunch. And when you look at novels that followed, on our ranking system here, when we have the Big Time, the Wanderer, Rainbow's End, and when I look at my criteria that I've documented down below, I can't say that, you know, this novel is going to surpass these wonderful novels when it comes to the writing, when it comes to the concept. Some of them have issues with the execution, which I think is a real downside to Hominids as well. It just did not execute on what I thought was a pretty good premise. Anyway, we're looking at the bottom of the board, as fascinating and implausible as that may seem, because this again just highlights how good these novels are. All these novels on the B-side, to suggest a novel that won a Hugo like Hominids did would somehow still rank towards the bottom of our list, which happens to be the case here. And when you look at books like Blue Mars, that, you know, Rover's fizzling out of a, you know, interesting trilogy, that novel still had so much more that I think we're definitely looking at the right side of the board. So maybe we need to take a look at No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop and say, is Hominids better or worse than No Enemy But Time when I apply my criteria? And I'm going to have to say, I'm going to give it to Michael Bishop, because I thought it was just a better written novel. It did have some issues with the ending and some of the things that just didn't quite come together for me, but I thought it was a better written novel, and I'm gonna have to give it to Hominids over The Healer's War, because again, The Healer's War, I just felt like it was a forced fantasy theme. It would have been a much better novel not going there. So there you have it, Hominids by Robert J. Sawyer. Not beating his previous novel, The Terminal Experiment by Robert J. Sawyer. I've got his other two novels, Hybrids and Humans, in the Parallax Universe trilogy. So if you'd like to see a full review of those, I'm happy to follow up with the sequels. Just to stress, I guess, that it is still a very decent novel. But I read the first chapter because I happened to be on the back of the novel here. And that first chapter, I don't know, man. I'm not quite sure if it's going to get any better than what it is today. So I will follow that up if there's enough interest. And please show that by, you know, commenting down below, liking and subscribing on this video, which will sort of help me decide if I want to follow up with the sequels. Have you read any other Robert J. Sawyer novels? What would you say was his best novel? I know he was also nominated several other times, at least another time, when it comes to the Hugo Awards. So he's a pretty popular writer, and I'd love to hear your opinions on him. I've been Peter, getting over this nasty cold. Hope to be full and in full health next week when I see you next time in the shed.